Why would the Atlanta Hawks trade their franchise cornerstone, a four-time All-Star who led them to within 2 wins of the NBA Finals at the exact moment when patience should matter most? On January 8th, multiple outlets reported that the Atlanta Hawks had agreed to trade point guard Trae Young to the Washington Wizards. The return package, veteran guard C.J. McCollum and forward Corey Kispert, for a franchise that built its entire identity around the 27-year-old floor general. Since acquiring him on draft night in 2018, the decision marks a seismic shift in direction. Young, Atlanta's all-time leader in assists with 4,837 and three-pointers, made with 1,295, averaged 25.2 points and 9.8 assists over 493 games with the Hawks. He led them to the Eastern Conference Finals during the 2020-21 season, establishing himself as one of the league's elite offensive engines. But this season told a different story. Young had played just 10 of Atlanta's 39 games, missing extended time with a sprained MCL before sitting out currently with a right quad contusion. In those 10 games he did play, the Hawks went 2-8. Now sitting at 18 wins and 21 losses as the 9th seed in the Eastern Conference, Atlanta faced their 3rd consecutive year positioned for the play-in tournament. The franchise had reached a breaking point, or so the transaction suggested. What the press release didn't explain was how the Hawks arrived at this moment. And according to sources close to the situation, the path to this trade was far more complicated than simple roster mathematics. People familiar with the matter say tensions inside the Hawks organization had been building for months, long before Young's injuries derailed his season. According to those briefed on internal discussions, the front office had grown increasingly concerned about the team's ceiling with Young as the centerpiece. The Eastern Conference Finals run during the 2020-21 campaign had created expectations that subsequent seasons failed to meet. First-round playoff exits followed by back-to-back play-in eliminations had sparked difficult questions about whether the current core could compete with teams like Boston, Milwaukee, and Philadelphia. But the concerns reportedly went deeper than win-loss records. Sources say that during the early part of this season, before Young's MCL injury, there were private conversations within the front office about the team's long-term direction. People familiar with those discussions describe a growing divide between two factions. One group believed Young remained the foundation for future success, and that the roster around him simply needed upgrading. The other faction, according to those briefed on the debates, had begun questioning whether Young's playing style could translate to championship-level basketball in the modern NBA. The injury situation, according to people close to the organization, accelerated the timeline for these discussions. When Young suffered the MCL sprain, sources say it created an unexpected opportunity for the Hawks to evaluate their roster without him. The results were mixed but telling. The team struggled initially as expected, but certain players reportedly showed development that caught the coaching staff's attention. More importantly, according to those familiar with the situation, the front office began receiving increased trade interest from teams around the league. What hasn't been reported publicly is that the Wizards had been quietly pursuing Young for weeks, according to sources. People briefed on the negotiations say Washington first reached out in mid-December, shortly after Young's injury. The initial proposal was reportedly different from what ultimately materialized, but it established that Washington was serious about building around a star point guard. The Wizards, according to those familiar with their thinking, viewed Young as the kind of offensive centerpiece who could accelerate their rebuild and provide a foundation for the next 5 to 7 years. Behind the scenes in Atlanta, the front office was reportedly split on how to respond. According to people familiar with the internal debates, General Manager Landry Fields found himself navigating competing pressures. The ownership group, sources say, had grown frustrated with the team's inability to advance past the first round in recent seasons. They had invested significant money in the roster and expected tangible progress toward contention. The coaching staff, meanwhile, reportedly remained supportive of Young, but acknowledged the challenges of building a championship defense with him as the primary ball handler. During a series of meetings in late December, according to people briefed on the discussions, Fields presented ownership with multiple scenarios. One path involved keeping Young, waiting for him to return healthy, and making smaller moves around the margins to improve the roster. Another involved exploring the trade market to gauge Young's value. The third option, which reportedly generated the most internal debate, centered on a complete philosophical reset, trading Young and pivoting toward a younger, more defense-oriented identity. Sources say the turning point came during a private meeting between Fields and key members of ownership in early January. The details of that conversation remain closely guarded, but what emerged from people familiar with it suggests Fields made a compelling case that the team's current trajectory wouldn't change without dramatic action. The Hawks had been stuck in basketball purgatory, not bad enough to secure high draft picks, not good enough to compete for championships. Young's injury, while unfortunate, had inadvertently created a window to make a move without the intense media scrutiny that would accompany trading a healthy all-star. According to sources close to the negotiations, the Wizards sweetened their offer in the days leading up to the trade. The inclusion of C.J. McCollum, a proven veteran scorer, reportedly addressed Atlanta's need for immediate offensive production to remain competitive while rebuilding. McCollum, at 33 years old, could provide veteran leadership and maintain the team's playoff aspirations in the short term. Corey Kispert, a 25-year-old wing with three-point shooting ability, represented a younger asset who fit the timeline of a retooled roster. But people familiar with the Hawks' internal deliberations say the decision wasn't purely about the return package. There was reportedly genuine concern about Young's injury history and whether his body could withstand the physical demands of being a primary ball handler over a full season. He had now missed significant time in consecutive years, and sources say the medical staff had privately expressed uncertainty about his long-term durability. Those concerns, according to people briefed on the discussions, factored heavily into the front office's calculus. What made the situation even more complex, according to sources, was the lack of clarity about Young's own perspective on the franchise's direction. People close to the situation say Young had remained professional throughout his injury rehabilitation. But there were private questions about whether he still believed Atlanta could build a championship contender around him. Unlike some stars who publicly advocate for specific moves or express frustration with front office decisions, Young had maintained a notably low profile during his time away from the court. Some within the organization interpreted this as contentment. Others saw it as quiet disillusionment. The negotiations reportedly intensified over the first weekend of January. According to people familiar with the discussions, Fields and Washington's front office engaged in multiple rounds of talks, with Atlanta pushing for additional draft compensation and the Wizards resisting. The compromise, sources say, centered on the specific players involved rather than future picks. McCollum's contract, which had salary implications for both teams, required careful structuring to make the deal work financially. Kispert's inclusion addressed Atlanta's need for a young wing who could develop alongside their existing core of younger players. Behind the scenes, according to those briefed on the matter, the Hawks coaching staff was informed of the potential trade just 48 hours before it became official. Sources say the reaction was mixed. Some assistant coaches reportedly expressed surprise that the organization would move on from Young so quickly, especially given his injury status. Others acknowledged that the team had struggled to find defensive cohesion with Young running the offense, and that a fresh start might benefit both sides. What wasn't discussed publicly, according to people familiar with the situation, was the emotional toll the decision took on certain members of the organization. Young had been the face of the franchise for over 6 years. He had delivered memorable playoff performances, established franchise records, and connected with the Atlanta fan base in ways that transcended basketball statistics. Sources say there were genuine relationships within the building that made the trade decision more difficult than simple roster evaluation would suggest. The Washington Wizards, meanwhile, were reportedly ecstatic about landing Young. According to people briefed on their internal discussions, they viewed him as a transformational talent who could shift their franchise trajectory overnight. Young's ability to create offense both for himself and others addressed Washington's most glaring need. The Wizards had struggled for years to find a lead guard capable of orchestrating an elite offense. Despite his injury concerns, sources say Washington's medical team had evaluated Young's situation and felt confident in his ability to return to full health. But there were also questions, according to those familiar with Washington's thinking, about how Young would mesh with their existing young core. The Wizards had invested in developing several lottery picks in recent years, and integrating a ball-dominant star like Young would require adjustments. People close to the situation say the coaching staff had already begun sketching out offensive systems that would maximize Young's strengths while involving their younger players in meaningful ways. As news of the trade broke on Wednesday night, the basketball world reacted with shock. A 4-time All-Star changing teams mid-season always generates headlines, but the specific circumstances, Young's injury status, Atlanta's play-in positioning, Washington's rebuilding timeline, made the move particularly difficult to evaluate in real time. What became clear in the hours after the report, according to league sources, was that both franchises believed they had won the trade. Atlanta felt they had acquired veteran production and a young asset, while avoiding the risk of Young's injury, concerns derailing their future. Washington believed they had landed a franchise cornerstone entering his prime years, who could lead them back to relevance in the Eastern Conference. The truth, as is often the case with trades of this magnitude, would reveal itself over months and years, not days and weeks. But in that moment, both organizations had made their bet on the future. And for Trae Young, a new chapter was beginning in the nation's capital, while Atlanta moved forward into uncertainty.